Okay, welcome everybody. It is about 1 minute to 11. I'm going to allow the session to populate and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Okay, it looks like just about everybody. I just have a few popping on here and there, but looks like most people are here. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. Okay, so welcome everybody to session 3 for MTSS for Educational Technicians. Again, my name is Andrea Logan and I represent the Maine Department of Education as the Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Specialist. My role at the department is to help provide training and technical assistance for schools in helping to design and implement their multi-tiered systems of supports for students. And this includes integrating systems and assessing student need, school need, from everything from academics to behavior to social and emotional learning to attendance and all of those kinds of things. A multi-tiered system of support is really what it says. It's a system of support that incorporates multi-levels of intervention and instruction for students. So those of you that are familiar with PBIS is a multi-tiered system of support. Those of you that are familiar with RTI is a multi-tiered system of support. And so as you're moving forward, you can think of these things, and then we can create other systems of support for other areas of the school that might be needed. For example, attendance or social emotional learning and things like that. Okay, frozen screen again. Here we go. Okay, so where are we headed with these webinars and in this webinar series? So far, we have covered multi-tiered systems of support overview, and we have briefly touched upon the problem-solving model for multi-tiered systems of supports. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about data and some data strengths, data pitfalls, as well as some other ways that we need to be considering data as we move through a multi-tiered system of support. And then session 4 is feedback. So relevant and timely feedback and how to use feedback in a multi-tiered system of support. Okay, so today's agenda, we are going to go over, excuse me, just a few housekeeping and logistics, not much, but just a few things have come up that I want to address before we get started. We're going to do just a quick overview of the last 2 sessions, just so that we can kind of follow that line of logic as we're moving through the 4-part series. And then we're going to talk about collecting and using useful data. So that is the agenda for today. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I have had an opportunity to communicate with a few of you through email, but all sessions in the MTSS series are being recorded and will be available as links. They will be provided on the Maine Department of Education website in the same place that you registered for this series. At this time, between MTSS and social and emotional learning and MTSS, I have, between myself and my co-host in the other series, almost 1,000 registrants that are trying to get access to this information. And I am the only tech person. So at this time, the recorded links for both SEL MTSS and this MTSS series will not be available until the end of the series. It can take up to 3 to 4 hours to polish and edit recordings. And on top of all of my other duties, I'm just not able to get them out in a timely manner. So they will not be available until the end of the series, but they will be available at the end of the series. Certificate links. We continue to experience many difficulties and struggles around folks getting access to their certificate. We understand that it is really important that you get a certificate for the time that you have spent in these learning opportunities. And many of us have tried different systems for certificates, some that have been really successful, some that have a lot of hiccups. And because every single session has a different amount of people accessing the training, and every single person that is delivering training has a different kind of role and a different kind of workload at the DOE, there definitely have been some challenges with the certificate links. So I believe in a growth mindset, and I believe in trying new things and trying to keep things as responsive as possible to those needs that people have. And so at the end of this particular webinar, in about 50 minutes or so, I will be dropping this link for session 3 certificates only. So session 3 certificates only. And what this form is going to do is it's going to record your email and your name and today's date. And then I will be sending you personally a certificate that you can print off, and then you can write your name on the certificate, and it will be for one contact hour for this session only. I am going to try moving away from the automated certificate generators. There's just so many technical things that have come up that I can't troubleshoot it all. So we're going to try doing it by, my handing you a certificate instead. So this link is not live. You're seeing it on my screen. I will be dropping it to you at the end of this session today. Speaking of the chat, it was decided among those of us that have been doing these sessions, especially those that have large numbers, that we have disabled the chat during the webinar session. It's very distracting to have the chat going on in the background because I'm not sure if you're trying to speak to me with an urgent need or if you are supporting each other. And while I hesitate to take away the support of each other aspect of having the chat, I am finding that most of what is happening in the chat are things that can be answered either at a later time, or they aren't necessarily content specific. They wind up being more technical assistance. And I need to start separating the technical assistance from the actual content. So you'll notice that there is not a chat feature in today's webinar, and that is by design. I will need to enable the chat feature so that I can drop these links to you, but I won't be doing that until the end of the session. And lastly, because I have taken away the chat, and this is actually an error in my judgment, I am going to be stopping my screen share here momentarily so that I can drop the parking lot link into a chat box for you. What I would encourage you to do is copy the parking lot link and then open up in your browser, and you can drop the parking lot link. If you have questions that come up about content of the MTSS session today, feel free to, or technical questions, content questions, whatever questions you have. What I'm going to ask you to do is send them to the parking lot. Google Forms will create a spreadsheet for me so that I can go through and I can categorize questions, and then it will be a lot easier for me to respond to groups of questions than it is to try and respond to them in real time in chat. It is definitely taking away from the content delivery. So I really want to try and just deliver content with as much integrity as I possibly can. So, but to do that, I believe I'm going to need to stop my screen share really quick so that I can drop that link to you. So give me one moment. Okay, so hopefully this is going to work in retrospect. So let's just see how this goes. Doesn't look good. Okay. All right, so let's see. Okay, So hindsight, that is not going to work because I can't change the settings during a live meeting. Okay, so more learning opportunity for me. I guess it just is what it is. I'm learning what to do and what not to do for the future, and you are all my guinea pigs, what it comes down to. Okay. So back to the slideshow. I will get these links to you just as soon as I can. Okay, bummer. All right, here we go. Okay, so getting into the review of what we've covered already. In session 1, we covered global understanding of RTI and MTSS, and we talked about navigating the tiers of intervention. And the primary takeaway of session 1 was understanding that MTSS is a layering of supports and not a ladder system. So many times we often think of tiers of a cake where you would take a piece, where you would go up a tier and you would step up to a different tier, with each intervention or with each response or intervention to a student response. When actually MTSS is a layering of supports. So it's where you continue with your base layers and then add on additional pieces to that base layer based on student response and student needs. In session 2, it was a pretty brief session by the time we were done dealing with technical difficulties. But in session 2, we did cover the problem-solving framework. And the problem-solving framework is that global problem-solving framework that a school's MTSS team is going to use to help figure out what is happening with a particular student or a group of students. And then it goes through a series of questions. What is the problem? Why is it happening? What will we do about it? And is it working? And we talked about your role as educational technicians in terms of how you could contribute to that problem-solving framework in instances where you may not be part of the MTSS leadership team, or you may not be part of a student's support team. And so we talked about some ways to collect data. We talked about how your anecdotal data and your daily interactions with students can help to support that problem-solving framework, because where you're the eyes and the ears of the school, and you find yourselves in all the different nooks and crannies of a school, and you find yourself serving all different types and styles and shapes and sizes of students, it's really important for you to be able to have a voice in providing real life information. And this is information that goes well beyond the quantitative information, right? It goes beyond the test scores. It goes beyond the Infinite Campus scores, or the project scores, or the MEA scores, or the NWEA scores. The data that you're poised to provide for the problem-solving framework is that of the human condition and that of the human side. You have a very unique opportunity, because of the role that you play in these kids' lives, to be that human voice when they aren't there to give their own voice, when others are sitting in some back room somewhere participating in this problem-solving framework to make decisions for them. And so the data that you collect is paramount in helping for this problem-solving framework system to work as good as possible. or as efficiently as it possibly can. And so we are going to dive a little bit more into that data collection and the importance of data here in the next few minutes. So session 3 on the website, session 3 is listed as universal data collection. And because every school is a little bit different, the way that you have been trained to collect data or the way that you have trained yourself to collect data is probably all going to be very different. But there are a few best practices when it comes to universal data collection that I think are important to mention and that you can play a vital role in as you get back to your schools in the fall, and even if you're supporting kids remotely. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are getting FaceTime with your students during remote learning, but you know, your data collection, again, is another set of eyes and ears on students when there's actually less probably eyes and ears on students now than there ever were, right? Because as kids are holed up in their homes, some with parents that are home not working, some with parents that are home and are working, you know, myself included. I'm shut up in my own room while my kids are kind of in the house, you know, waiting for snippets of time when I can go and help them with their schoolwork and things like that. But ultimately, there are less eyes on students now than there were when you were in school. And so you're having an opportunity to get some FaceTime with your kids. The anecdotes or the data that you take down based on those interactions are really crucial because it helps to continue to keep a pulse on the profile of that child, what that child is expressing as their needs, their concerns, their wants, but as well as really making sure that we are adding the pieces to the puzzle that are needed so that when we do start to get into having to get back into these decision-making processes and problem-solving processes, we'll have as much data that we can possibly have. I know one question that has come through recently is, how do we support kids that we can't reach? Well, you know, the answer to that is, I don't know. I mean, because how do you take data on somebody that you don't see, right? And so, you know, I know that some districts are really struggling to make connections with some families. And so, you know, it's really difficult to take even anecdotal notes, you know, with somebody that's not in front of you or somebody that's not posting to the Google Classroom or not handing in their paper packets or however your district is doing it. But universal data collection has a few caveats that are really important. And these are all good discussion points for you to bring back to your supervisors, for you to bring back to your school administrators, your MTSS team members. And sometimes MTSS teams in schools are known as student support teams or student support networks. And so MTSS can come by a couple of different names without it always being, oh, we are the MTSS team, right? Whoever is managing the student supports for your school, that is ultimately part of that MTSS team. And that includes general education, special education, and the like. So as a whole, at its impetus, MTSS is a data-based problem-solving process. And so when you take the layered systems of support and you layer on the problem-solving process, you then have to layer on the data-based decision-making that drives that problem-solving process. And so we are building from the ground up. We have your tiers of support, your problem-solving engine that moves within the tiers of support, and then you have the data that feeds the problem-solving process, right? So the data feeds the problem-solving are the gears in the tiers of support, And then you apply the layers of support as needed based on the answers that you get through the problem-solving framework and the data that goes into that problem-solving data or problem-solving framework, for example. So if you think about it, data is like the ingredients that that goes into the blender to make smoothie, right? And so depending on how good the ingredients are is going to depend on how good your smoothie is, and then whether that smoothie is going to meet the needs that you're looking for within, you know, whether you're trying to prevent fatigue, or if you're trying to prevent skin breakouts, or you're trying to prevent skin breakouts and increase your energy, depending on what it is that you're looking to get out of that prevention or that intervention. And so ultimately, the data that you collect needs to be objective, relevant to student goals, useful, and accessible. So objective, relevant to student goals, useful, and accessible. Okay, so those are the 4 primary criteria that you want to make sure you are looking at as you are collecting data points in your school, for your small groups, for your one-on-one students, and the like. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what is affectionately known as the data headache. Data has become somewhat of a boon in education, and this has resulted in a lot of data fatigue. And primarily with data fatigue, you know, one thing that I hear a lot, and I used to hear a lot when I was in schools, I even think that I have said myself in the past is, okay, so we collect all of this data and we never do anything with it. Who is using this data? Where does this data go? What am I using this for? How does this relate? It's really difficult to collect data. Data. And in my mind, I can picture just all of this data that I have collected in the past, and the data that my peers have collected in the past. And what's tricky about it is you know, you spend all of this time collecting it, but you don't always spend the time using it. And so the more precise that we can be with our data collection methods, the better we can avoid the data fatigue or the data headache. So I would say that there are probably many people in your school that really get a headache when they think about data, or they really feel drained by the idea of having to navigate through data. And so one of the ways to mitigate that is to really concentrate on focusing on really precise data points that meet those 4 criteria that we just talked about: objective, relevant to student goals, useful, and accessible. So some common concerns around data. Numbers tend to cause anxiety. You know, I don't know about you, but if you aren't a maths person, perhaps the idea of looking at a bunch of data points causes some discomfort for you. It makes you uncomfortable, maybe because math is not your thing, or maybe because you're concerned that you haven't collected enough points or the correct points. Or maybe you've got too much data and it becomes very overwhelming. And so numbers in general can be one of those naturally causing anxiety agents in the world. Another thing that is a common concern around data is that data can be hard to interpret. If you have too much of it, if it's not useful, if it's not relevant enough. One of the processes that a researcher has to go through is something called cleaning of data. And that's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like cleaning blueberries in July. You know, if you rake blueberries and you've got this flat of blueberries, one of the things that you have to do before you can use the blueberries is you have to go through each of the blueberries and pick out the stems and pick out the leaves, pick out the, the berries that have gone by, or the berries that aren't useful, and you kind of have to clean the berries, right? And so data is very similar in that way. And because of that, data can be very hard to interpret, because if you don't have the time to go through and clean the data points, then the data that you're actually getting in front of you or that you're presenting to somebody else isn't necessarily going to be the pure picture or the pure view or the cream of the crop rather that you're looking for. And so that process can make data difficult to interpret, because when it comes to interpreting data, you have to be able to take the time to really pull out the pieces that you're looking for so that you can put them together and interpret them with fidelity. And so when you get back to those 4 criteria of data, it's important that you try and stick to those criteria as you're collecting your data on your students, because the more integrity you have with your data, the less cleaning of the data that you have to do in the end, which will then make it easier to interpret. Some other things about data is that it can bring to light issues that you might not want to deal with, or that your MTSS team might not want to deal with. And this is kind of a dark place here, and wow, like, to think that I might mention, oh, I don't want to deal with that, or I'm just going to set that aside. I mean, it happens, folks. When you see something in your data and it's an issue, but maybe it's not an issue that you had on your agenda for that day, or it's not something that your school wants to focus on right now. It's one of those things that you can't unsee it, right? So if you know that there's an area of your building, or if there's a group of students that are particularly struggling, but that doesn't fit into the scope and sequence of that semester or the scope and sequence of that school year, or it doesn't align with the goals that a school has set out for themselves for that year, then you kind of have to make that decision. Do I add this on and try to do them both, or do I set this aside knowing that it's a problem? And so sometimes data can bring issues to light that you might not be willing or ready to deal with. And sometimes I think ed techs may find themselves living in this place because again, with being the eyes and the ears of the school and really being that human connection for kids in sometimes some of their hardest times and their hardest hours, areas of concern that you see, and you see it all the time. And one of the hardest things that you have to do sometimes, I think, is to know when to press it down and know when to bring it up and know when to not bring it up. And so that can be stressful, and it can be hard to sort of live in that dark zone of knowing what might be best for a group or for a student, but knowing that it maybe isn't going to be addressed in a timely manner or at that time. Another common concern is that data collection takes time away from instruction. Yep, it's true, which is another reason why you want to be super deliberate in the data that you collect, so that you can preserve as much of that instructional time as possible. And then another common concern is that data can be misused, and that is correct. Much like the same ingredients go into making cookies as you use to make cake, data can be misused or used to show different things at different points in time, given what it is that you're looking at. And so you have to be cognizant that what you're collecting is as clear and precise as possible, and that you're looking at all the parameters that come around with the data that you've collected and the story that the data is telling. And it can be hard not to make that data tell the story that you want it to say, versus that the story that it is trying to say. So some typical data collection methods, and I would say so these are the two primary data collection methods. So there's numerical or quantitative data, so N for quantitative and numerical, and narrative, which is more of a qualitative data or language-based data. So numerical data could be adding points, charting, graphing, check marks, even token systems. For those of you that might have students that are working with token systems, that's all considered numerical data. Narrative data is language-based, so that's anytime you interview somebody or you have a conversation with somebody. Narrative data could be artifacts that you collect from student work, or pictures, or written pieces that a student has created. Even notes that you have taken on a student would be considered an artifact or narrative data. And then observations. So observations that you have taken and that you have annotated or given notes to, those are all considered narrative data. And neither one type of data is more powerful than the other. They both have their place in an MTSS system, and both of them are useful in determining how to navigate within the tiers of intervention and how to navigate between the layers of support. What's more important is, as you collect data, making sure that you're collecting data that, again, is useful and relevant, but then also knowing where to store that data, or having a universal place to store that data so that it's available to others that might need to see that data based on that student. So that was one of the other criteria that we talked about a few slides ago, was making it universally available. And so that's a conversation point to bring up to your MTSS teams, because I know that in the past, for me, what I have experienced is, the different ed techs, depending on who their supervisor was, would take data differently. Sometimes they kept it in a notebook. Sometimes they had it in a locked classroom, in a file cabinet. And that's great, except when a sub comes in, or when somebody else comes in and has to take your place. The more universal your data collection methods are within your building, the easier that it is for anybody to provide support for that student at any time. And so one of the conversation points that I would highly recommend is done and brought up to your MTSS teams is, if you don't have a universal data collection method in your school, what kinds of conversation starters could you use to help facilitate or get that conversation started? Because the more accessible that the data is equally as important as the type of data that you're collecting and what the data is being used for. So again, systems for collection and storage. Data that is collected should be universal, it should be uniform, and it should be stored in a central, secure location. Some other things to think about when it comes to data collection is anonymity. I can never say that word. I can see it in my head and I can never say it. But anonymity. So using student initials instead of student names. Because when you collect your data and you store it in a central location, only those that have a need to see the data should be seeing that data. And so that way you can protect the privacy of your student based on, based on who they are, and making sure that their privacy is protected. But when I say universal and uniform, what I mean by that is the more universal, meaning whole school, that you can make your data collection system, the more relevant that it will be and the more usable that it will be for your MTSS team to access when they are preparing to do the problem solving process for a group of students or individual students. And same goes for the idea of data being uniform. So, you know, collection sheets that are uniform, but then could be, you know, could be modified for an individual student, but where primary pieces of information are collected and in a uniform way. So if you think of a piece of paper, you know, it has two sides. And so perhaps one side is the school-based uniform collection system, but then, you know, if there are different things that Johnny needs, you know, you could print that on the back side. Or like for your Google Forms, if you're going to use a Google form, you know, maybe you've got some uniform pieces that you're going to collect, and then there's a separate section, for example, for, you know, an individual child and their individual data points. Uniformity is important because what we really want to do, again, is we want to make the data as accessible and as useful as possible. And so when an MTSS team in your school gathers to talk about a particular intervention, if they're talking about the tier 1 universal setting, if they're talking about a tier 2 small group intervention or a tier 3 even smaller group intervention, the last thing that you want them to have to do is to interpret the multitude of ways that teachers and ed techs and school counselors are collecting that data. And so while you can't whitewash all of it, you can make it easier to access so that when you go to peruse through the data, you kind of know where you're looking for certain things so that you can pull those things out and quickly have access to them. I mean, can you imagine if you went to the bank to apply for a loan and every single person that walked into the bank got a different loan form? Can you just imagine how difficult that would be for, you know, the loan officer to be able to get the information that they need to decide whether they're going to approve or deny that loan? Or buying a house, for example. You know, if there's a certain set of uniform things and in a certain place that data is collected to decide whether somebody is prepared and ready to be able to purchase a home. Can you imagine if that process was different for every single person? So when you start out with a uniform system, you can then modify the different parts of the uniform system based on an individual's, you know, unique situation. But for the most part, especially in some of the more universal tiers, such as tier 1 or tier 2, a universal uniform data collection system really pays dividends in the end. It's a lot to put together in the beginning, but it definitely saves time and relieves some of that data fatigue or that data headache in the long term. And then stored in a central secure location. This is another one of those talking points that I think every MTSS team should consider when they're thinking about their universal uniform data collection. And ultimately, you know, these things would be stored in an office of some kind where any person that has access or has educational reason to have access to a student's information can do so. Because if you're an ed tech working with a student, a 7th grade student in a 7th grade resource room, if that resource room teacher is out sick that day and a different ed tech needs to come in and provide support for that child, it can be really tricky to get someone to come and knock off the door, and who has access to that, and where is the key, and oh, that person has the key to that filing cabinet home with them, and things like that. So it's really worth a conversation to think about how to universalize your data collection and storage in your school so that the data that you collect can be accessed by those that have reason to access it with as little draw on your resources as possible. And when I say resources, I mean your emotional and your physical resources to be able to deal with that situation. And so having these conversations really is an important part of using or doing data collection in a way that is done with integrity and done with fidelity. So the next part of the data conversation are decision rules. Now, decision rules are predetermined goals or checkpoints that are used to determine whether to continue, modify, or fade a support. Decision rules create the lens for which you view and collect data. And as an ed tech, you should know ahead of time what the decision rule is for a particular student receiving a particular intervention. This helps to frame the work that you do with a child. It helps to frame the questions that you ask and the data points that you collect. And it helps to relieve some of that data fatigue because you can take your lens of what the decision rule is, and then you'll know what to look for during what could be considered the scavenger hunt of working with a child during the day. So it really helps to hone in the kinds of interactions and the kinds of questions that you are engaging in with a child, so that when you're collecting data, whether it be numerical or narrative, you can help to make sure that the data is precise and relevant so that it can then be used during that problem-solving process. So ultimately, decision rules are a roadmap for where you want to go and what you want to do with the student. And like we said before, these are predetermined. So if you find yourself in a classroom, for example, and you know that this particular student, will say Sarah. So Sarah's a student who really struggles with writing, and she has some additional supports for writing. So she attends writing in the regular education setting. But she has an ed tech that comes in and checks in with her for 15 minutes in between writing class and art class. So she has an ed tech that comes in and she gets an additional 15 minutes for going through her writing. So she gets, the in-class time plus an additional 15 minutes of writing support before she packs up and heads to art with the class. And so a decision rule for Sarah might be that she has to make a certain milestone for a certain number of days with her writing, whatever that may be. Maybe it's number of words that she has to write, or maybe it's quality of the writing that she needs to produce, whether it be, handwriting or coherency in her writing, things like that. But a decision rule is that thing that she's aiming for. So let's say that for Sarah, because she really doesn't enjoy writing at all, she just really struggles to produce any writing at all. And so the decision rule for Sarah's intervention is that for 10 writing classes, she will produce 5 full sentences during writing class, right? And so that's her intervention. She's got a quantity goal. Well, if you're the ed tech that's coming in to provide support, that additional 15 minutes of writing support for Sarah, and you don't know what the decision rule is, how will you know how to support that 15 minutes of time with her? Because if you're just told, oh, Sarah just needs you to work with her for an extra 15 minutes on her writing. And what Sarah wants to do is to look at the few words that she has produced and perfect all of her T's and dot all of her I's. And you're over there trying to provide support for her without knowing what the decision rule is or what the goal is that she's working for. You can't truly shape that conversation with her, right? And so knowing those decision rules creates a roadmap for where you go and what you do with the student so that you can maximize the time that you have with that student. It's the decision rules that drive the movement between the tiers. So let's say the intervention for Sarah is that she's going to get 6 weeks of an extra 15 minutes 3 times a day with an ed tech to help her with her writing production. Without knowing what that rule is, then you know that 6-week time window could be 6 months or 6 days. How will you know? The other reason why it's important for you to always know what the decision rules are for an individual student when you're providing support to them is because when you see it, or when you see the progress, or when you see the stagnation in progress, that's an opportunity for you to bring that conversation up with the classroom teacher, or bring that conversation up with the case manager, or whoever it is that is in control of this person's progress through the tiers of intervention. And so when you, as the ed tech, see that, oh my gosh, look at this, we've really started to make some progress, and every time I come in to check in with Sarah, I only need 5 minutes with her. I just need 5 minutes to help her get over that hump, because now that she has started to produce all of the writing that she's supposed to produce, it's become a habit, and her muscle memory is helping her get there every day, and she doesn't need me as much. So what we don't want is for her to continue through with 6 or 7 weeks of continuing with an intervention that maybe she's ready to have faded away, or maybe she's ready to have that be built upon. And so it's super important that you, as the person that's providing some of these levels of intervention, to know what the decision rules are so that you know how to shape that conversation and know when to bring it up to a teacher when it's time to have that person's data looked at to decide whether you're going to continue, modify, or fade that level of instruction. So again, with our tiers 1, 2, and 3, remembering that we are layering on supports, we are not taking them away. So in the example of Sarah and the writing, the preventative measure is that we keep Sarah involved in her regular education writing setting, so long as she is able to be successful in that setting. Now, decision rules apply in the preventative setting as well, because before we can subject the student to additional layers of support, we have to make sure that the preventative layer of the MTSS system is working at least 80% capacity. So when you have students that are struggling with writing, for example, one of the first things that the MTSS team should do is to step back and look at the classroom as a whole. And they need to assess, are 80% minimum of the students in this writing class able to make progress that we are looking for in this setting with the measures and interventions and instruction that's in place? If an assessment of that tier 1 setting doesn't show that we're at least 80% capacity of success for students, then before we pull Sarah and maybe the 2 or 3 other kids, or 4 or 5 other kids that look like they need intensified writing supports, we need to really assist in taking a look at that preventative measure to make sure that there's not something that we're missing in that preventative layer or in that tier 1. And so decision rules apply for the universal setting as well. And one of the well-documented decision rules for Tier 1 is that 80% mark. One of the ways that the percentages break down in MTSS is 80% for Tier 1. There's generally 15% at Tier 2, and then about 5% that need Tier 3. That's the numbers. That's the that's the stuff that you find in the literature. That's the stuff that you find in trainings. And then each school is going to be different depending on the socioeconomic makeup of that school. There are going to be schools where Tier 2 actually looks more like Tier 1 because of the level of need that happens in that school. And that's okay. That just means that the ingredients that make up that school have a baseline where 80% of the children need that Tier 2 setting. And then their Tier 3 primarily becomes their Tier 2, and then the intensive interventions just continue to layer on and on and on. And so decision rules are not only for small groups of kids or individual kids, it's also part of the preventative layer of the tier system as well. But knowing what those decision rules are is vitally important to helping the MTSS system, whether it be behavior intervention, academic intervention, social emotional intervention. What we don't want, again, is louder, longer. We want to make sure that we're being responsive to how a student is responding to an individual intervention. Another example, as we are coming up on the 12 o'clock hour, is really understanding and keeping track of how different students respond to different interventions as well. Another example would be a child who seems to be lagging behind in phonics, right? There are some really great evidence-based, computer-based phonics programs that are available. And because computer-based programs in the long run tend to be less expensive to implement, and they have a lot of bells and whistles, and they're gamified, and you can earn badges, and generally kids really enjoy them. They're not for every kid. So if you have a student, for example, that is looking to make progress in their reading, and one of the interventions that's prescribed is, in addition to reading class in the regular education setting, we are going to prescribe 15 minutes of, say, Lexia on top of that, and then you find 15 minutes in the day to add that layer of intervention on. But you find that that child is not responding to, this evidence-based practice is not working for this child. You don't want to keep the child in that setting for any longer than you need to be. After a few weeks, you really want to go back to that problem solving and say, wait, wow, Lexia is this program and we spent a lot of money on it and everybody's trained on it, and it's evidence-based and it should be working. It must be the kid. Well, what if it's the program? And what if it's not a good fit between the kid and the program? And so those are things that have to be constantly questioned as you are navigating in between the tiers. And knowing the decision rules for kids helps to shape and form and sort of frame the data that you collect on each of those individual kids. Okay, wow, so we really covered a lot today, and there is actually still 3 more slides to go through, but I think we covered this one. So decision rules at Tier 1 at 80%, decision rules for Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we talked a lot about that. Data points, above or below goal line, how to look for those things. And so in the end, decision rules are the lenses for collecting and viewing data. One of the things that came up as a need way back when we were designing these interventions, or this professional development, was how to help ed techs interpret data. And when I really sat back and thought about that, I do believe that that's an important thing for ed techs to be able to do, is how to interpret data. But I think that before we interpret data, we have to make sure that the entire school has a common ground for how to view and collect data. And so that's really the first step before interpreting. And one way to do that is to know the decision rules for each tier and group of students so that you can use that in your data collection, because then interpreting the data becomes a lot less complicated. And then opening up conversations, encouraging universal, uniform, and central places for data collection for everyone to have access when they need it. Whew. I hope that was useful for folks. So because I didn't think ahead about not being able to reinstate the chat, what I am going to do is I am going to email out the link for today's certificate, because I have created a certificate that I am actually going to send to you that's not automated. And I am also going to email the parking lot. So if you happened to jot down any questions based on content of today, or any lingering technology or technical assistance questions, you can go ahead and send them to me in the parking lot. So you can be expecting to get an email from me sometime in the next 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and send those right out to you. But my email system only allows me to do, I think, 100 at a time. So there's more than 100 in this meeting right now. So give me a few minutes to get 128 emails sent out to you. And yeah, so just let me know what else we can do. And then on Tuesday next week, we will cover feedback and pull everything together. And then what I'm hoping to do is cover feedback in probably the first maybe 20 to 25 minutes. And then what I'd like to do is do some kind of activity where we'll break out into some breakout rooms and then apply some of the skills that we've learned based on just navigating tiers, the problem-solving framework, data collection and fidelity, and feedback, and see if we can't put together a little activity to try to pull all those things together. All right. So thank you very much for attending session 3, and I look forward to session 4. Have a great day.
Thanks, Danielle. It's been very helpful. Your webinars are always really full of great information. Really appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
I second that, absolutely.
Great, I'm so glad. And today I really listened to the feedback that I got at the end of last one, and I really eliminated the tech questions. Gonna try to handle those outside of the sessions. And I really tried to make sure you guys got a lot in this hour, because I know last hour was a little bit, what do we want to say? There was a word that I was going to say. It was like slim, or not slim, but like, I don't know, it was just very light. We just didn't get through a lot. So this, I think this made up for it, because I barely got through everything, and I feel like I talked a mile a minute. So,
it was great. You guys have done an amazing job.
I do listen to your feedback. I really do. I read through the form and I look at it and I'm like, oh, people want more of this and less of that. So I am trying. So keep the feedback coming. I'm going to send the parking lot to you. I do take that to heart, and I am trying to respond in as many ways as I can to the needs that are out there. So
Thank you very much.
Appreciate all of you. Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.